We move now on to our expert panel with Baroness Kramer, John Blenkinsop, Laura Fattar, Mariana Fataki, Kate Kenny, Lorenzo Pascoli, and Ian Monroe. And I'm just waiting for everybody to open up on their videos. Well, what I'd like to do actually is the key question that we put to everybody was the idea of, we've got so far with the concept of the Office of the Whistleblower, and we're very grateful for you for putting forward your bill in the House of Lords to take it to the next stage. And we recognise that one of the major obstacles is getting it on the government agenda. What I'd like to do is actually just take that as a central topic and pass it around between the members of the expert panel. You all have slightly different aspects of looking at this. So, Susan, can I start with you to kick it off, please?
Well, I'd be delighted, and absolutely delighted to pick the brains of all the others on the panel. So, first of all, to say that, you know, we go after this issue and getting an improved set of circumstances for whistleblowers at every opportunity. So the fact that I've got a private member's bill asking for an independent office of the whistleblower doesn't mean that when we see pieces of legislation come through where we think we can get an amendment in, and say if it's financial services legislation, by definition, by the scope of the bill, what we would do would have to be constrained just to financial services. We still would try and push amendments to create some sort of structure which would make a difference and help. So it's a case of trying to sort of punch this target from many different angles in order to create awareness, increase intensity. And many of us want to see progress, even if we can't get everything that we think would be appropriate. As I say, we've got two problems at the moment. One is that the pandemic is creating complete havoc with the parliamentary timetable. So the House of Lords hasn't been considering any private members' bills at all. And I have no idea when we go back to business as normal. This is normally Friday business, and the Fridays are being used for all kinds of other purposes and not for these bills. So we've got that set of problems. And we also have an even worse time than usual getting the attention of government ministers. I mean, it's going to be really important to find a champion somewhere in government. I suspect Kevin could be useful with this, Mary Robinson, who is the chair of the APPG now. We've got various people I think could be useful in this process, but with departments absolutely drowning in what seem to be immediate and urgent challenges, it's very difficult to get attention. On the other hand, I think the pandemic has made the case even more powerfully, because the failures that have been exposed and potentially rectified because of those who speak out often have life and death implications.
Thank you. Kate, you made a comment when we were discussing this expert panel that we must look beyond the law. You said that in many cases good law is not sufficient to protect whistleblowers. We need something else. What would you go to for something else?
I mean, I think that's the point has been kind of, well, hello everybody, and it's nice to see so many people, other participants as well, and viewers that we would know and work with in our research. I think that the discussion so far has kind of tended around, and valuably so, to kind of look at the high level of what we need to imagine a different society where citizens have kind of democratic accountability, as Emanuela said, and where law is taken seriously and implemented. And these things are incredibly important, but you know, we do need to realize that law, accountability, these sit within wider cultural and normative and wider ideologies and imaginations about who we are and what we do, okay? And I think this is really, really key. I mean, back to Baroness Kramer and Kevin Hollerake's comments on the FCA, which were absolutely astute. And in light of COVID-19, I mean, we are going to need regulation of financial institutions. We're going to see ordinary people losing out hugely in relation to mortgages, lending, these kinds of things. And just to point, there was a study for people who are interested out last week or the week before, conducted by Protect, on how things are looking for financial sector whistleblowers. And it's pretty chilling, I have to say, if you're interested in how ordinary people are going to be helped or otherwise to come out of the pandemic. It turns out, you know, three out of four of the whistleblowers that they were talking about talk about organization-wide systemic wrongdoing is what they're seeing, not just one department or individual. So we're kind of back to those issues, these breaches of regulation that got us where we didn't want to be in the 2008 crisis. So things are not well within the FCA, but I think that in terms of what we need to do, we have to realize, I think, that certain sorts of laws and regulations are set up as cardboard shields. You know, they're almost parodies of what they're intended to be. And for us to kind of bash the FCA, I mean, the FCA has 12 people on the whistleblower desk. Well, it did in 2019, the last time I looked. It's been gradually defunded. I mean, it seems to just not be designed at all to effectively protect whistleblowers, and I mean structurally. So to kind of critique law and these regulatory structures at face value is disingenuous, because they're existing in a wider economic and ideological context that has set them up to fail. So this is kind of why I'm keen that I think Mariana mentioned cart before horse and horse before cart. All of these things need to be included and discussed. But you know, we do kind of need to look at the ideological and imagination landscape in which we are, and particularly when it comes to the FCA. And I just want to say, I'm not here kind of moaning on about financial sector. You know, I have written a book moaning on about financial sectors being terrible at protecting whistleblowers. You know, but what I do want to say is that this isn't inevitable. You know, I think we act like we are in this historically permanent moment where regulators cannot be trusted and they're part of the wider landscape of corporate interests, of private sector interests. It's not always the case. So, I mean, if you look at the savings and loan crisis, for example, in the United States, and you look at the work of regulator Bill Black and others there were more than 800 prosecutions coming out of that. I mean, these are people put into handcuffs. They were having 90% success rates when it came to convictions. These were bankers sent to jail. And this was because there was well-funded regulatory authorities that actually had criminal referral departments built in, that had political support. So that's what a decent regulatory framework looks like. And so I guess what I'm saying is we should dream bigger and insist better about democratic accountability, as Emanuela spoke, and about the law being taken seriously, and look at how we can return and, you know, reinvigorate those kinds of historic moments. So that, you know, this is really, really key, and to look at the imagination and the ideologies that are at play, and to look at how these aren't always at play, and to look at how alliances might be built. We're certainly in this moment coming through the pandemic where economists are suggesting that we can do growth differently, that we can do economics differently, that financialized capital is not the only game in town. It cannot be, for very clear reasons to do with sustainability. Privatized healthcare systems cannot be the only game in town, and there's evidence to show that these do not have good outcomes and are not sustainable in the long term. So perhaps the alliances that need to be built to look differently at how regulatory structures, at how we can bring this democratic accountability to bear. So I guess this is what I mean when I say beyond the law. It must start with the law and incorporate the law, but it has to go other places too.
Right. Can I turn to Laura at this point in time and say that you in Protect have been doing something in this area just quite recently. Would you just like to clarify that for the rest of us?
Yeah, certainly, Ian. Thanks very much. And I must say it's a privilege to speak on this platform and on a panel with Baroness Kramer and yourself. So thank you so much for having me. And thanks also to Zoe and James. Yes, Protect are also attempting to look at some draft legislation. I think essentially it's a really complex thing to try and do, to try and cover off all bases and to make a system that works. The Office for the Whistleblower is an amazing start. I'm so glad we've got it on the statute books, because what that is really kind of making the point is that the wheels are in motion. This is going to happen. I'd really like to highlight, if I may, two governmental developments which have happened really recently. So we had the local authority fraud report that came out from the Housing, Community and Local Government Department, which was incredibly supportive of whistleblowing, saying that whistleblowers, potentially are preventing up to £2 billion worth of fraud from local authorities, and really saying that more needs to be done. It was silent on what legal reforms might come, but I think that's a really welcome change of tone. And even this week on Wednesday, I think we had Rishi Sunak in response to Mary Robinson, kind of welcoming the idea of whistleblower reform and how that could be put into place. Two things I'll pick up on really quickly, because there's a lot to be said, but I'll try and be succinct. I think what the messages that have come out from others, which I very much support, are that we need a shift in culture. And that is the only way that really we're going to have more whistleblowers feeling safe to come forward. And it needs to be a shift in the culture of organizations as well, to actually see that whistleblowers are coming and bringing them a gift of information rather than a problem that needs to be solved. So our bill focuses quite strongly on two things. We'd like to see, as Lorenzo mentioned, enforceable legal obligations on employers as to how they handle whistleblowers, how they deal with reports of victimization and what feedback is given. And also standards then to be put onto regulators. And there will, of course, need to be an overarching body to enforce those standards. But I think ultimately, victimization of whistleblowers happens in the workplace, so it needs to be addressed as early as possible. And if there are clear legal requirements as to how whistleblowers are handled, hopefully that can give whistleblowers the ability to enforce some of those standards. And if action is taken on victimization, this is one of the key ways that we can actually get a culture shift. Because at the moment, it doesn't seem like that's happening very much at all. And we can see through, again, back to financial services, but we can see through Jess Stately how when whistleblowers are victimized and no action is taken, that has massive repercussions for the sector and for whistleblowing generally. It has a real silencing effect. So if we're serious about pushing this forward, I think we need to have mandatory standards and a very absolute zero tolerance policy to victimization. And that's a sort of a capsule of what we're trying to work on at the moment.
Thank you very much. I want to turn to Ian Munro here, because Ian, you've been doing quite a lot of work in what we call networked whistleblowing. Would you like to pick up on what Laura's just put forward there? Because there seems to be a number of threads which come straight into the ballpark of networked whistleblowing.
Thanks, Ian. Yeah, I think there have been really massive transformations in the way in which whistleblowing is being practiced, and it's obviously the whistleblowing support groups such as Protect and so on, and Governmental Accountability Project and various support groups are very well aware and supportive of these projects. It's very different from the legal side of it in some respect, because it's a civil society movements. And I think the alliances is building alliances, which Emanuela talked about, and also Lorenzo on some level, is really important. Kate alludes to it, the imaginary. We have to actually demand more. I'm going to bring it into this independent office issue. So one problem that has been highlighted by a number of people today and previously is the sort of co-optation of either internal regulators and external ones, yeah. And the notion of independent, how is that going to be established? So my concern would be, if you had a truly independent, the organizations often that whistleblowers and their supporters are taking on are extremely powerful institutions with a great deal of allies in business, in politics, and in law. And if they're doing their job, my concern is they'll end up in Belmarsh prison, facing extradition if they're independent. They'll be accused of all sorts of things. If they're not, the problem of the sort of triage approach is they may end up managing what we get, basically effectively a censor. So there are all sorts of interesting questions that really need thinking about. It's an age-old problem. Who guards the guardians? It's really massive progress, of course, the conceiving of the independent office of a whistleblower and getting that taken seriously. But still, there's a lot of really interesting institutional questions that we need to think about.
Well, I want to pick up on that one. We have in attendance out here, I know we've got a representative from NHS Forward, and I know that we have a representative from the National Guardian's office. And perhaps as a moment of reflection on what you said there, that when the National Guardian's office was set up, following on from the Francis report, one of the glaring discrepancies I saw was that those who were appointed were not out with the medical profession as independent whistleblowers. They were part of the medical profession. And I wonder whether, when we come to the question of who guards the guards, whether the guards were deliberately inserted by a greater organization to ensure that the reputation of the organization was sustained. It didn't come under successive assault of whistleblower after whistleblower. And that touches again on the validation process of how do we actually see this happening and how do we see it running, and on the battle of reputations, which is at the heart of everything. And from there, I want to turn to John Blenkinsop, if possible, because John, you had some ideas on the role of PR considerations within whistleblowing, and I think this reputational war is fundamental to the whole argument, and that pertains back to public relations, of course.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, a lot of the research I've been doing on whistleblowing is in the context of health, and what is often surprising is that, the old football pundits thing about he managed to miss when it would have been easier to score. When you look at some of the issues that come up, you think, actually, it would just have been easier for the organisation to address the problem. It's actually quite interesting that they chose to have a stand-up fight with the whistleblower, and they really, really go for them. I mean, the example of many medics get referred to the GMC even after the hospitals fired them. It's kind of we kill you and then we desecrate your grave almost attitude. And I think it's interesting because I wonder to what extent it fits with an idea of being overly obsessed with reputation, with image, and with a way of approaching things, which is the classic PR idea of kind of getting ahead of the game, controlling the narrative, etc., etc. Instead of stepping back momentarily and thinking, how bad would it be if this got out? When I used to work in the NHS, we actually got the editor of the local newspaper in once to have a chat about why there were so many bad news stories run. And he said, I run plenty of good stories for you as well. It sells newspapers, stop whining, kind of thing. And at the time, I thought this was outrageous. But with hindsight, I think in a sense he was right. It didn't make any huge difference to the hospital. We didn't have kind of people not coming. We didn't have people protesting or that sort of thing. The stories were just there and gone and forgotten about. And a lot of the defense that goes on, the retaliation against whistleblowers, is a kind of reputational defense, which is an exaggerated response to the damage that the organization might encounter. And there is a naivety in what I'm saying, because, if you think about some of the examples that have been used earlier about the astonishing bonuses available to people from the status quo, you understand why they go for the whistleblower. But in other situations, it would seem like addressing their concerns, dealing with the issue, would actually be the easier thing to do. But they don't. They really go for it. And I've been quite struck by this in the context of COVID-19, because, of course, in one sense, the whole pandemic started with suppression of a whistleblower's concerns. And if you think about what might have happened if the issues that Dr. when Liang was raising had been dealt with when he raised them, we might be tens of thousands of deaths prevented. And I have a PhD student of mine who's currently doing a kind of quick examination of the media. One of the depressing things is it rolls through. So you would think that given that it started in China and that there was an unhappy repression of a whistleblower, which led to the outbreak being worse than it should have been, that other authorities would have learned from this and thought, actually, if people are raising concerns, we should maybe listen. And what we're finding is that the mistake is just repeated. It's a bit like the graphs that say, oh, we're 3 weeks behind Italy or whatever. It's the same sort of effect. We suppressed our whistleblower a month after the Chinese suppressed theirs. And I think that's really depressing to see that nothing is being learned from that.
It would be very interesting for some other Port PhD student to actually do an assessment of all the major cases and look at the financial and reputational loss that big companies and big organizations have sustained, as opposed to if they just dealt with it in the first place. How you quantify that, I'm not quite sure. I
think it would be fascinating.
Rehab.
I think something that makes it, I think, particularly topical is there's a very strong link, I think, to the behaviour of organisations in response to whistleblowing and what we're seeing at the moment in the discussion around cancel culture. Because organisations are quite happily throwing long-serving staff under the bus in response to a brief flurry of negative publicity about something they may have said once or tweeted 10 years ago or whatever it is. And I think that's the same kind of attitude that says, oh my God, we have to control the PR, instead of thinking, why don't we just stick our chin out and weather this? And this isn't a party political point, but I think if you look at Dominic Cummings as an example, if there's enough determination, you can weather anything. So there's a lot of companies who are firing very good people for a minor infraction of the current norms kind of thing, and where if they just held the nerve and waited, frankly, days in some cases, the mob would have forgotten and moved on. But the attitude that we have to win the PR war, we have to preserve our reputation at all costs, I think is deeply embedded. You're on mute, Ian.
No. Can I turn now to Mariana and say, Mariana, you do quite a lot of work in mental health and the impact on the individual and on the well-being of the individual. From James's chat earlier, do you think that actually whistleblowing should be ascribed to a specific moral injury and therefore could be compensated?
Oh, Ian, an interesting question. Thank you very much. So I'm doing that work with Kate and Stacey Scriva and in a variety of projects. So I think obviously whistleblowers at an individual level teach us so many things. First of all, they teach us civic courage. And as I think I have put in the chat, without informed citizens and citizens who are actually prepared to enact their role as citizens, that is, as political beings, I think we will unfortunately have the situation of the bravest, and perhaps there is so much research. Who are the whistleblowers? In fact, what makes them actually, as you, Ian, do? What causes them to speak when everybody else actually prefers to look the other way around, right? But I think in a way, and I don't know if you, and obviously these individuals have to be not only recognized retrospectively after they are destroyed and turned into movie stories when they are actually no longer dangerous. They have to be compensated, and there are various ways of doing this. And Kate and I had another project on actually trying to think about, post-disclosure survival strategies and what society can do for whistleblowers. For example, giving them a job would be like an obvious thing, but yet the most difficult, in fact. Even the people who are exonerated, vindicated, like Dr. Stephen Bolsin, just to speak about healthcare, you know, the guy who actually blew the whistle on Bristol Inquiry, Royal Bristol Infirmary, end of the 90s. And it's by now accepted that this disclosure has been instrumental for reviewing the clinical governance arrangements in the NHS, but also in increasing actually, you know, the funding for the NHS. Which brings me, Ian, to my most important point. And the most important point is what whistleblowers teach us, not only about civic courage as individuals, but actually they point the finger at ills in our society, at various ills, and those ills are systemic, because as Ian Munro said, I mean, we assume that everything works. Well, if everything worked, we wouldn't be where we are, right? So the question is, what do we want whistleblowers to do? Do we want whistleblowers to sacrifice on our behalf? Or do we really want to heed on the disclosure and act on it? And I'm not so sure that as a society, we want the latter. And COVID, for me, is a great accelerator and a great opener. It's a big opportunity for us to actually, as Kate did say before, to just try to think in a bigger way about what are the priorities, what Lorenzo said about values, and how do we want our corporations to make a quick buck, for example, in terms of our pension investments, and yet we don't want them to invest in unethical kind of investments, right? Your story, Ian, we want actually, you know, Saudis to buy weapons from us. I speak as a British citizen now. And then we don't want actually to know about this, right? We don't know that, we don't want to know that they behead people every Friday, like on the central square, like with a sword, right? So I'm just trying to say, maybe we shouldn't treat our citizens as dummies, actually, because people want to know, and maybe many people want to act, and we shouldn't be seeing whistleblowers as exceptionally courageous individuals, because when we say the bar so high, then it's not for commoners, right? It's for Ian Foxley, maybe for Catherine Gunn, but it's a very difficult proposition, because what deters people, to your question, Ian, your PhD question, what deters people, if I may just say, is that when they don't see that anything is being done, the disclosure comes and goes, and the person who discloses the wrongdoing, evidence-based wrongdoing, is just his or her life gets destroyed. So I just want to say, what do we want to do as society with whistleblowers? How do we want to treat them? Unless we answer that question, we wouldn't be answering actually the essential issues about whistleblowers.
Exactly. I'd like to pick up on a couple of themes there. Susan mentioned earlier this morning that whistleblowers are just ordinary people. We are. We're not special. We're put in a position, we fall into being a whistleblower. We don't plan to be a whistleblower. We just are confronted with the situation and have to make a decision. And it's a balance of values and what you'll put up with and what you won't put up with. And what we expect is an appropriate response. And I think the problem with the whistleblower is not the person themselves, it's a response of the organization to an ordinary citizen or employee who comes forward with an observation of something that is not right. And maybe the organization can explain why that is happening. Maybe they you know, there are many different ways of looking at something. But all the complainant, the disclosee, the whistleblower wants is to be effective. They want to bring notification that something's going wrong. They want it to be corrected. And in most cases, they just want to go back to doing the good job they were doing before. They don't want anything special. They don't want different treatment. They don't want, you know, a bag of gold. Unless you're going to rip away my whole future, then yes, I take Susan's point again. You should be appropriately compensated. And again, go back and read. It's only just published this week, this judgment in Rehan versus Ernst & Young. And if you look, because I think it's a precedent, and I think it's a path that may well be followed in future, of appropriate compensation, not just for the immediate loss of the employment and the remuneration that went with it, but the loss of future career, the loss of future employment, the loss of all prospect of actually having a fulfilling life. That is something which, if we come back to this idea that Susan was iterating about compensation in the round, that is what came out of the Rehan case. And I think that is an example that everybody, go and find the judgment and read it, because it's fascinating. And to come back to John's point about reputations and whether it's worth it for the reputation, if you look at what Ernst & Young and their barrister was saying about Rehan, it's absolutely appalling. It's egregious. It is outrageous the way that they belittled him and said that, you know, he was a fantasist, that he was seeking public grandstanding and compensation, when actually all he was saying was, this is not right. this is a crime that's going on, and it ought to be, you know, dealt with. But that doesn't happen. But again, thank you very much indeed for that. Lorenzo, can I come back to you now, please? You started us off earlier today with corruption and other forms of criminality and whistles blowing and whistles unheard. Has anything changed in what you've heard today? Is there any way that we can put something else in place to bring about the office of the whistleblower?
Yeah, I think, I mean, I was so pleased to attend today because the amount of stimuli, I would say, that came from all the speakers and the participants was amazing. So yeah, I have a lot of ideas here that I took note of. So first thing is the definition of whistleblowing. I think from Professor Cheva's speech and from the following questions, I think that we still need to keep the discussion on what is whistleblowing ongoing. And your point, Ian, about corruption and malpractice is very good, because we need to pass the message, and that is a cultural change in itself, that corruption is not just criminal offenses. And until this message is very clear to society and to the politicians, there will be no change in the law and no change in culture. So there is a very interesting study commendable by Ellis and White, been published 2 years ago, I think, or 3 years ago, about how people perceive corrupt practices and how they're perceived by the law. So they ask a number of people, I think more than 1,000 people in the UK, do you think this practice is corruption? Do you think that practice is corruption? The answer was always yes. And then they revealed that actually those practices are totally legal in this country. So how come that we have a large portion of the population that believes that certain behaviors are corrupt and they're not punished or criminalized or made illegal by the institutions? So I think we need to have the discussion. What is whistleblowing? What practices count as unethical, illegal, unlawful? And this is a discussion that shouldn't always, or shouldn't only happen in Parliament. A discussion should happen in intellectual circles, in cultural circles, in grassroots organization, association. This is something we all should promote. We are all here because we all think that our thoughts can contribute to reshape society. So this, I think, what is whistleblowing and what is corruption are fundamental points to be discussed. The second point is that I agree, and that was my main point in my presentation, we need to change culture. But I am afraid that if we focus only on sort of a vocational or idealistic aspiration, we need a change in culture. We all agree with that, but we need to be practical. And to be practical means taking a gradual approach to things and change the little things we can do today. Because if we start thinking too big, we will never achieve change, because we will have a political barrier, we will have social barriers, we will start having people saying, well, I don't agree with your idea, I don't think culture should go that way, I think culture should be that way, and we end up in the swamp of relativism, which we do want to avoid. Let's start on things we all agree about. Let's start on little things. So I do think there is an immense value in keeping criticizing the law, because the law is something that can change relatively easy. One word can massively change the implication of an entire statute. So I think there is a lot of value in starting with a piecemeal reform. And I think perhaps from my academic point of view, what I would like to bring to the table is a reminder. I'm sure you all know about this, but I think it's very important to remember of the process that brought us to business ethics. In the 80s, economists such as Milton Friedman were claiming very openly and candidly that capitalism was the way forward. There was no other model that was attested by all possible evidence, and possibly is even true today. The bottom line was that greed is good. That was very well epitomized by the movie Wall Street, but the movie of three totally respectable statements. What happened in the 90s is that the music changed, and a sort of intellectual movement came forward with the idea of stakeholder theory. So companies cannot just pursue the interest of shareholders, those who hold the money, but also of people which is affected by company work. Good. Then from that point of view, we started saying all companies have a moral duty to be ethical. Fine. Third step, which is the step in which we are today, and I read a comment about this today, they don't have just a moral duty to be ethical, they have a legal duty to be ethical. So now the law prescribes companies to be ethical. The next step, the future will be, but I think still we're not there, not only they will have a duty to be ethical, but they will have an interest to be ethical. So the law is now trying to make it convenient, interesting for companies to behave ethically. The point is, you don't change a culture in one day. It took at least 30 or 40 years to reach the stage we are today about business ethics. We can't have a revolution on cultural issues that are ethical, morally relativistic, delicate. We need piecemeal dialogue, reform, discussion. I mean, events such as today's event are exactly what they mean. We need to start talking about concrete things. So, conclusion, Office of Whistleblower. This is exactly what I mean, a first step. Now, of course, we had loads of questions before. How do you make it independent? Well, we'll have to discuss about these things. I have a lot of solutions in mind, and I'm happy to discuss them with you, but it's not about me. It's about starting the process. I mean, and about the relativism of the values, how do you want it? Do you want it that way? Do you want it that way? We have an answer. There is never right or wrong. There is a right process to go to the reform. The process is the key. Morality is not discussed by saying, I think this is right, I think this is wrong, because we can go on forever. The changes happen when we know how to do things, when we have processes in place that are ethical. That's what we need, the right process. Go ahead.
And I think you bring us to the core of our question, which I'm sure will come up in the open discussion in a few moments, but or after our tea break actually, which is how do we make it happen? And the execution and the delivery of the Office of the Whistleblower as an independent agency to safeguard the job and the remuneration and the health of the whistleblower is just a pipe dream unless we come up with concrete steps and a plan of how to take it forward. And the essence of that, I mean, I'm a believer that it has to start in government, that it has to start with the legislature actually signing up to the fact that this has got to happen. And I posited earlier that, you know, we're in a time of great change with modern communications and with the internet, where we can, you know, we can see, we can grab, we can record, we can publicize things. And I think we're at a time of change. And I really do think that COVID offers us an opportunity to go out and rethink a lot of our society. And a part of that is whistleblowing. And so I'm going to hand it back to Susan Kramer to take that last offering in the last 2 minutes, please, that we have before we go to a tea break. Susan, it's about, I would say, legislation and getting it through the government so that individuals as well as organizations are held to account, both in terms of response and in terms of retaliation. Over to you.
Well, I mean, let me agree with so many of the speakers. The independent office of the whistleblower, the legislation, that it is never going to be a utopia. But I think it can fundamentally change the framework in which whistleblowers operate, and it gives us a platform for ongoing and continuing reform and a flexibility for ongoing and continuing action. But the reason why I focus on it particularly is that I work in a place that does legislation, and there is no other place that we can do legislation. So the work on culture, I think, absolutely crucial. Some of these issues around looking at reputational risk, the way in which companies respond to PR, I mean, they're hugely important issues there. And I do think it will be helpful as we go, at some point we will get an opportunity to discuss this in a legislative platform, the Office of the Whistleblower, to sort of bring in the kind of ideas that people have, how this could be done sensibly and as a good process. When I tried to draft, when I drafted this, and I am no expert drafter, nor am I expert in sort of with the whistleblowing arena compared to the other people speaking today, was to try and set up something that had within it, that was purely a framework on which one could build. You're absolutely right, Ian, that we will need to engage. We need someone in government to buy into this and to make sure that it is on the legislative agenda. And at that point, when they engage, we really will need to have intensive conversations about what this should look like. And whatever the government brings forward, we will then, it will happen primarily in the Lords because of the way Parliament currently works. So we will then try and amend to strengthen or to change or to bring in missing pieces or whatever else. But that government buy-in is key, or we simply don't get the parliamentary time to be able to pass this. I have a feeling that if you brought all of the legislators together in the House of Commons and House of Lords and sat them down and put the issue in front of them, they would be overwhelmingly enthusiastic and overwhelmingly supportive. So it's getting the mechanisms to work, and government controls that lever.
Well, there's only, at best my reckoning, I think about 660 people in the Commons, and I think about almost 2 to 3 times that in the Lords. So you're only really talking about 1,500 people out of a population of 70 million. That's good odds. So how do we get them into one place and actually say, look, this is for the good and benefit of society. This reaches across healthcare, business, child abuse, proper running of charities. It touches on every side of life. And it is for the common good. How do we get it on the agenda?
Sorry, my system seems to have decided that it's going to crash in a minute. But so you don't need 1,500. First of all, I mean, I think within Parliament, people who actually influence and shape things and don't really focus on other roles, that are probably at the most a couple of hundred, but you don't even need that. So what we need to do is find someone within government. I mean, if I was going back to the coalition era, it would have been someone like Oliver Letwin, who kind of had an overarching role in government rather than being embedded in a single department. Unfortunately, the character that seems to play that role today is Dominic Cummings. I think we're going to have to find someone else, because I can't believe that this is particularly high on his agenda. And so I think those positive comments, for example, from Sunak are very promising. We also want to make sure we don't make it a political party battle. because it seems to me this is something that is completely cross-party. I mean, I'm a Lib Dem. I'm obviously working with Kevin and Mary very closely. There are Labour people who've been involved. Annalise Dodds was very involved before she went on to the Labour front bench. So they're possible players there. So I think one mechanism is to use the APPG to try and bring these people together. It'll be easier when we can actually do that physically rather than always trying to do it virtually, but virtually is a start. That's, I think an input from those who have been thinking around this issue, that might be a very timely thing to do. And I will propose that to the APPG, that we try and identify people who have the opportunity to put some real thought into what the Office of the Whistleblower should look like, and see if we can pull those folk in for a discussion. And then always with politics, serendipity plays a very powerful role. You watch for your opportunity, and when you see your opportunity, you pounce. So, anything anyone can do to look out for the opportunity and the pounce, that can always be critical.
Well, it occurs to me that we've just had one actually with Dominic Raab actually unilaterally bringing sanctions against those who commit corruption and those who try to keep quiet whistleblowers. And I hark back to Saudi Arabia here and the dreadful way, the absolutely appalling way that Jamal Khashoggi was dealt with.
Yes,
Yeah.
And I have to say, that there are many things on which I disagree with Dominic Raab, but I was impressed by his determination to act. But when I think, I don't think you'd have to go back to many previous people in his role deciding that Saudi Arabia was a too important arms market to do anything very dramatic.
Indeed, and I think politically, if I look at the global scene, Saudi Arabia is at a position, both economically and politically at the moment, that they could be open to closing the GPG Airbus case, but on the back of that, actually bringing a change about how whistleblowers are treated. I don't mind being a precedent in that regard, by the way. Big enough and ugly enough to have been, to have been used like that before. So I think that's an opportunity, and I think that if we can come up with collectively, and I really do speak to the nation's experts in whistleblowing research and evidence here, if we can come up with a concrete plan that actually defines the strategy for how we are going to go forward, to bring it to the notice of the policymakers in both houses, and actually perhaps even run a register where we get them to, we go around them individually and sign them up one by one and say why, and if they won't, say why won't you? Because to say no to something like this will be terribly, terribly embarrassing.
Well, we have the public with us, I think. That is crucial. And that opens up an opportunity to conversation. But it sounds to me as though we need some real strategy conversations, and thank you for some real contributions to what we should do. And I hope we can keep engaged around this.
Thank you very much indeed. It's been pointed out to me by my two minders off to my right-hand side here that we're not going to have a break. We're going to move straight into the open discussion. And we have a mounting body of questions here. And I'd like to actually field them one by one to you. The first is from our good friend, Wim van der Kegel down in Greenwich, who asks, what is the necessary characteristic of an Office of the Whistleblower so that it has teeth? And I think perhaps I'd like to give that straight back to you, Susan, if you don't mind.
Yes, I think this is something that needs a lot of discussion, but I believe absolutely in the principle. I mean, we have various ombudsmen, if you like, are, in a sense, independent offices, but very few of them have any teeth to do anything. They can advise, they can recommend, but their scope is carefully limited. And they find themselves, I think, more of a PR exercise than as a genuine agent of change. And you need to make sure that the office can do what it says on the tin. I think it's got to have some sort of independent funding that has to be sufficient. It must have a range of powers and the ability to come back, and it may have to go to Parliament to ask for additional or reshaping of powers if it finds that they're inadequate. It's got to have some sort of relationship that is clear with the regulators. And that's a tricky one. Regulators don't like to be answerable even to Parliament, never mind to anybody else. But I think that we're going to have to think through how that relationship is managed with regulators, because even though, as I said earlier, in a sense, they will be taking away from regulators part of the burden that regulators absolutely detest having to carry. So what you want from the regulator is the action that cures the problem that's been identified. And also it's forced to make sure that a whistleblower doesn't receive retaliation. But so I think there are various ways around that. I mean, I think for the purposes of legislation, you don't have to decide on all of those structures, but I do think it would be very helpful, and I need your help, to clarify the various elements that we want to make sure are in place. So this is a work in progress. And as I say, you've just had a few of my thoughts, but I'm very conscious that I have only a limited amount of expertise in this area.
Can I bring in two people, actually, one after the other? I'm going to start with Laura. You can just unmute yourself, Laura, to complement your thoughts, because you're running a parallel piece of legislation, to whatever Susan has said. And then I'd like to come back to Emanuela, who I haven't got a face at the moment, but I hope she's still behind her thing at the bottom there.
And can I say, I think with the PIDA reforms, we're not in, we're running in parallel in terms of timing. We're not in conflict in any way.
Good.
I would very much support the reform of PIDA.
Thanks very much for handing over. Appreciate that. Thanks for supporting the reform of PIDA. I think inarguably it is inadequate in its current state. When Protect have been thinking about this, we've used a slightly different name, so we call ours the Whistleblowing Commissioner, and that's mainly to try and avoid confusion with the Office of the Whistleblower in the States, which is very much rewards focused rather than sort of anything else. But one scenario which perhaps could work would be if the Office of Whistleblower, or whatever the name of it is, were to have a series of standards that it would impose, and then it would regulate as to those standards. So I think it could be quite unwieldy if it's receiving all of the whistleblowing concerns and then making sure that all of them are addressed correctly and that there's no sort of victimization to the whistleblower. However, if there could be almost a top-down approach where the office or the commissioner says, this is the minimum standard that you have to perform in terms of, what feedback you give to this individual, how you treat this individual. And if hopefully regulators will understand the benefit of ensuring that when employers breach those standards, they should have a role. And then the office can have a role where the regulator doesn't breach those standards. So it can be very much tiered. And I think that may be slightly more bureaucratic, but I think it also may be slightly more workable and a bit clearer as to what's expected of all the kind of different parties. Where that gets its power from and which department it sits in and how it's funded are all very good questions that I don't have a strong feel for, but I think that's how we get there, really. That it's these conversations that we have, and we can, identifying the issues and thinking about solutions is how we're going to get a better landscape for whistleblowers. So
Okay.
I guess I'm just a little bit more interventionist, if I may come in, in the sense that I do think that the government would say today that, we've told all the regulators what they need to do, and all the regulators would say, but we do what we're told to do. So I'd like to make sure that I don't care if it's called a commission, whatever the name, but had more interventionist power, because you can see it's very hard to lay down a set of expectations that don't turn into tick boxes. Good organizations don't make them tick boxes, but organizations that haven't bought in to the whole idea and to the benefits, or given them priority, do end up falling very much back on tick box. And we've talked today a lot about the FCA. I think if you look at the FCA, its process probably gets an A on every single tick box item that's been asked of it. The problem is it is hopeless, and it doesn't deliver. So I think part of the call that we have for trying to look for something new is to enable a more responsive and interventionist approach when that is looking at some of the outcomes, if you like, and judging whether or not and somehow enabled to make change as a consequence of outcomes that are evidently not appropriate. So it's quite tricky, but I'm just concerned that what we don't do is formalise the current system. That is going to be a difficult thing to do. If you want me to try and say, sometimes with, if you look at somebody who's Andrew Tyreen, when he was head of the Competition and Markets Authority, really aggressively leading on that and demanding a whole lot of change. I mean, he has now walked because he's not going to get the powers he feels are necessary for consumer protection. I think that expresses some of the problem. There's a
military truism. There's a military truism that keep it simple, stupid, is a great thing to follow. Yeah. Because if you make it too bulky, if you give it too many guidelines, you give it too many standards, you give it too much bureaucracy, it will slow down the process. And effectively, this is a very simple process. It's a battle of what is right and wrong. There are ways to treat people and there are not ways to treat people. And the idea, the whole concept of the Office of the Whistleblower is to act as a guardian to those who want to speak up. I come back to my two key findings from my research, is that what stops people is fear, because they observe what happens to other people and they see what's going to happen to them, and ineffectiveness. What's the point of going into that minefield if in treading in there, I'm going to get killed, but I'm not going to have any change in the whole system? And those are the two things that have to be addressed. I want to turn to Emanuela, because I know that you've been wanting to actually make a couple of comments here, and then to Kate, if I may. But I've got a queue forming of people I know want to comment on these things. So Emanuela, to you first, please.
Okay, thank you very much. It's just a general point, I suppose, that came out a lot in Lorenzo's discussion, but I think it sort of goes across many of the things we've heard today, which is the relationship between the moral and the legal aspects of this story. And that strikes me as a particularly important dialectic or tension to investigate for two main reasons. The first one concerns the identification of the kind of wrongdoing that may be the object of whistleblowing. So here, Lorenzo alerted us to the risk of focusing also only on unlawful behavior. And that's, as a corruption scholar, I'm particularly aware of this problem of identifying corruption with what the law says is corruption, therefore discounting all sorts of behaviors that I would say violate office accountability, so therefore signals some kind of abuse or misuse of power of office, which nevertheless should be considered as relevant objects, precisely because they might undermine institutional functioning, just like what the law happens to say does or not. So that's the first point, where an integrated approach between law and the public ethics of office may actually prove important. And the other point concerns the nature of the regulation, the treatment of whistleblowing, especially if we consider whistleblowing, as I've suggested, a type of duty. So here again, Lorenzo was urging us to think whether whistleblowing should be best conceptualized and in fact implemented as a legal or a moral duty. And that changes dramatically the practical way we go about whistleblowing. I mean, if we understand it as a legal duty, then it means that failing to perform the duty involves the sanctions and so on and so forth. And then all the narrative about offering incentives and the use of nudges becomes redundant and irrelevant. I mean, you don't need incentives to pay taxes. I mean, you've got a legal duty to pay your taxes. If you don't, you get a fine. And if we understand whistleblowing this way, all the talk about incentives becomes immediately redundant. But if we understand it as a moral duty, then it makes also a lot of difference in terms of whether we conceptualize whistleblowing as an individual duty, which is what the current state of affairs is, and what many also of you in the panel and in the audience who had to act as whistleblowers themselves had to face. They were acting on a moral duty, a duty of conscience, a duty of integrity, a duty of justice that they felt they owed either to themselves or to the community or other agents. But if we understand it as an organizational duty, then we can give a different description of whistleblowing itself and of the kind of actions that are necessary for opposing it, and also the kind of measures to make it effective would change dramatically. I suspect, although I have no empirical evidence for this claim, that many of that behind the difficulty that many people have to come forward. So that's Ian's research question. So what deters the people from coming forward? There's also this idea of being of bearing a very demanding duty that it's up to individuals to discharge and to bear the cost on their own shoulder, while integrating this view.
Can I pick up on your idea of moral duty there?
Yeah, sure.
I know I'm coming to Kate in a moment, but I think I want to nail this one now. That in any relationship, be it between a married couple or a teacher-pupil or a nurse and patient or an organization and employee, there are two sides to the relationship. And there is a moral duty in both directions. The employee, as the more vulnerable, the inferior, if you like, in a power relationship, has a duty to speak up when they see something wrong. They have a moral duty, if you see something wrong, to speak up about it. But the other side of the relationship is that the superior, the organization, and the leader of the organization has a moral duty to respond appropriately. And I think that sometimes we forget that. And I think that a lot of what happens and how people who disclose wrongdoing are treated badly are because the organization does not live up to its moral duty to respond appropriately to the individual. That's a comment I'm going to leave it there because I want to get to Kate, I'm afraid, who has been waiting to say something in the sidelines. Thank you, Mela. Kate.
Yes, no, thanks, Ian. I just want to respond on the point, I think, that Baroness Kramer and yourself, the nitty-gritty stage that we're at now when it comes to the Office of the Whistleblower. We are preparing submissions for Ireland's transposition of the EU directive on whistleblowing. And so this is one of the issues that comes to mind. What sort of entity or institution can we look to for an oversight body? So we've contacted a number of experts that have been working on this question, including who've been looking at the Dutch House of the Whistleblower, which obviously will be informing your thoughts. So some of the major kind of issues seem to be coming out now that we've had a chance to observe around the fact that, well, first of all, staff and experts within the Dutch model institution tend to be resourced from government, and to have a sort of this has been seen perhaps to sort of frame how they treat whistleblowing incidents, especially around the public sector. A second thing is around the issue of expertise, okay, like we're coming into a massive area of economic constraint where, practically speaking, proposals for massive new entities are not likely to be welcomed with open arms. I'm just trying to be practical here. And so the other thing to note is that for that reason, some experts are saying what we need is to beef up the prescribed person system. But in response to Baroness Kramer's very real point that in fact it's not working, and you gave the example of the FCA, they're not doing what they're supposed to, and certainly some of the reports that have come out recently on how they're regulating organizations that are implementing speak-up systems. I mean, training is inadequate, protection for whistleblowers is inadequate, all those things. But if it was a case of giving an oversight office teeth to regulate the regulators, but in a meaningful way, because here's one of the big issues. What we know is the second biggest reason a whistleblower doesn't speak out is because they fear nothing will be done. And experience in the House of the Whistleblower in the Dutch model is very clear that when people speak out, they want to know they're talking to an expert. I mean, you mentioned the US example of who cares if you're speaking to a smiley-friendly call center person who's going to sort of take your details. You want to know that the very complex algorithms, and work is getting increasingly complex now, not just in IT, not just in finance, but you need to know that the person at the end of the phone understands the nature of what you're trying to say. And so I'm just thinking of the resource implications of adequately stocking an Office of the Whistleblower with the kind of expertise in all the sectors that would enable proper oversight. I think just briefly, a third thing is that there's questions about how useful it is to have advice to the whistleblower, sanctions, and investigations all under the same roof, because traditionally, as you know, in regulatory authorities, these can create sort of tensions. So there's some of the learnings that we have to consider. And I suppose what some people are saying is that, back to the idea of teeth on the Office of the Whistleblower over prescribed persons, where sanctions or some sort of accountability is actually in place, is what some experts are saying as this oversight body. So I just wanted to make those points, put that on the table. That's what we're seeing emerging now. These are some of the questions. I don't have the answers. Okay.
Can I thank you very much for that. I think I want to make two comments. The first is about teeth, that there's no point in having it if you don't give it teeth. We look at what's been tried, and I'm sorry if the members of the NHS are still there, but let's look at effectiveness. Effectiveness will only be apparent if you are seen to be able to bring sanctions against either the trust or the chief executive of the trust or the board within it who have not done their job properly to protect those who have brought disclosures of wrongdoing within your organization. My second point is about funding, and I recognize that the very valid point about living in a post-COVID world. We are facing times of financial hardship across the board, and in fact in a number of countries. But that shouldn't stop us going forward with an idea of the Office of the Whistleblower. The idea of funding, I offer you what happened in America, where Barack Obama loaned, in effect, the Office of the Whistleblower. He loaned them $245 million, which they paid back within 3 years, and then became if you like, a profit center for government, which was alluded to earlier. And David Green made this point at Cambridge about 2 years ago, and he said, look, if we don't do it, somebody else will. Will go to America, where there is a regime that will compensate them properly, and those funds will actually go into the American coffers, not the British coffers. So economically, there's a very good argument for funding it. Kate, you wanted to rejoin on that?
So very briefly, I don't want to hog the time, but yes, but the US Office of the Whistleblower, the 0.1% of whistleblowers who appeal or who go forward for these sorts of rewards that are generating the kind of revenue and that are followed up by the US government. It's a tiny percentage of whistleblowers. But I believe that the model that you're more interested in here in the UK context is one that actually helps a lot of whistleblowers, which, you know, I think is the key thing. And regarding teeth, I think the issue is responsibility for the regulatory authorities as well as the organizations that they regulate in order
Absolutely.
for sanctions to be in place and responsibility to be in place.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that. I wanted to take now one of the questions that we've got stacking up behind me here, and ask, what impact do international recommendations have on whistleblowers in the UK? And I'm going to give that to Lorenzo, I think.
Yeah, very happy to try and answer. I do believe that we need to contextualize this question in the particular situation that we tend to forget now because there is COVID, but which is Brexit. So there are two dimensions to international regulations. There are international regulations strictly considered, and these are the international regulations that come outside regional organization. So for instance, the United Nations, which at the moment is relatively uninterested in the issue of whistleblowing. Or there are then supranational or regional regulations, such as the EU, which are more effective because they concern a smaller number of countries and they have perhaps more powers. Now, we all know that the EU has now taken a massive interest in whistleblowing and is being very much pushing for appropriate regulation. Now, the question we have at the moment is that I think twofold answer. So first of all, international regulation proper, so UN level or global level, must be empowered. We need to do much more work to have proper, binding international regulation on whistleblowing, which is still yet to come. Well, we need to work towards that. Second side of the question, we do yet have the European Union regulation. But of course, some may say, oh, but the UK is leaving now the EU, there is Brexit, and therefore they might lose track of the European obligation. I say to this is an unrealistic expectation. The way Brexit is taking shape, I believe, will not change the sort of deference that the UK will have towards European regulation. This is something we cannot avoid anymore. The world is now very much entangled. The globalization is so advanced that it is impossible to undo it. And the UK, even the European Withdrawal Act, is just about retransposing European regulation in the UK. So there will be, of course, massive tensions with the EU regulation, particularly in NHS, the way we spend our money. Of course, that's something. But on the issue of should we protect whistleblowers and what sort of protection we can afford, I don't think there will be a disalignment. So I do think that external regulation, European and international, will have a massive impact. If anything, the UK will try to show that they're even better than Europe after Brexit, and therefore they will be committed to show that.
Come on.
I don't want to go down that route. We want to talk about whistleblowing, not Brexit. Sorry. In my seminars, I actually have a banned word. In fact, I have two banned words. The first one is Brexit, and the second one is like, because the new generation can't string two sentences together without putting like in the middle of it somewhere. So I'm going to ban that word if we don't mind, Lorenzo. And thank you very much for that, but I'm going to move on that note. We have a question from Katerina. Do global market dynamics influence business models in a way that creates or invites misconduct? And I think this is an interesting question that I'd like to throw to Ian Munro, actually. Ian, you'll need to unmute yourself.
Sorry, what was the question again? I was just thinking about the international, the previous.
Well, it's part of it. Do global market dynamics influence business models in a way that creates or invites misconduct? I.e., it's the old battle of God v. Mammon.
Absolutely. There's a lot of work at the moment about the way in which privacy rights and are routinely violated by social media companies and so on. And the rights to assembly and all sorts of rights are being trampled upon every day by the large gig economy corporations, such as Uber, Amazon, and so on. And it's built into their business models. It's what makes them these huge amounts of money. It's not some kind of incidental issue. And I think that's true of many more established companies, oil companies working in, if you think of Shell in Nigeria and BP in Colombia. And I mean, there's no, the Middle East, I mean, it's just arms companies in the Middle East and so on. It's a major problem. But coming back to the previous question, I'd just like to add that the UN Special Rapporteurs have actually produced numerous reports commenting explicitly on the need for whistleblower protections. And the UN Human Rights Council and these special rapporteurs, as a member of the Human Rights Council, you have to give a response to the Human Rights Council if a special rapporteur raises issues about human rights violations. And Britain, Sweden, and the US are not responding in recent cases, which is a matter of deep concern, given that Dominic Raab's ostensive commitment to human rights. But I think, yeah, there are huge issues. The UN, I think, is an interesting body in that regard, because you've got the Global Compact, UN Global Compact, which companies sign up to and make various more or less explicit commitments. And I think that certainly the commitment of companies to human rights is absolutely very closely related to, or should be closely related to, whistleblower protection.
Thank you for that. We have time for one last question. And the one I've picked is from a chap called Stephen Andrews, who I happen to know is an Arabist and an authority, having worked for some time in a different culture in the Middle East. And he mentions that Lorenzo mentioned public interest is not a single coherent point of view. And he posits that rather it's being prescriptive on public interest. Should we try to find a more flexible framework that takes into account different cultural viewpoints? Lorenzo, would you like to come back on that?
I've read the question, and I'm glad you brought it up, because I didn't want to let it unanswered. Now, public interest is a group of points of view. You're right. I mean, the person who asked this question is right. It's relative what is in the public interest or what is not. I think, Ian, you made some example as well, where protecting public interest at all costs sometimes may lead people to hide malpractice. So, yes, but the point is not that there is a universal set of values that we all should agree. That is dictatorship, that's totalitarianism. But although, as Ian said before, we cannot forget, and I think in these times we tend to forget this, that there are universal values. Human rights are universal. There is nothing to say. So they are, because states agreed upon them on binding documents. So yes, I agree with relativism, but I also think that there are strongholds of values that we should hold to. But apart from that, I think, as I said before, the solution is process. The solution is never merit in itself, because if we start debating on values, we can all possibly disagree. The solution is process. And the processes that we need to follow are the democratic processes: discussion, welcoming diversity, pluralistic point of views, confrontation, means to have different opinions coming together and assessing the merits. And another big point which tends to be neglected is research. Research, scientific method, evidence, these are the things which should drive policy. So yes, there might be debate on relativistic values, but we have in place, and we must have in place, processes to select what values are convenient. And secondly, we must do that based on scientific evidence.
Thank you very much indeed. I have one more question that's been slipped to me just while we have a minute. and that is from South Africa. And I'd like to welcome Mathebisi Moyo, who is a PhD student, I believe, down in South Africa. Welcome. Thank you for getting up early, if you're still if you're in a different time zone. She asks that lots of legislation in South Africa is aimed at protecting the whistleblower, but this is not borne out in the practical experience of the whistleblower. How can they be preemptively protected, and how can they be empowered? I don't know if any of the panel have a speciality in South Africa. Laura's raising her hand, so you've thrown yourself into the lion's den, Laura. Off you go.
Thanks very much, Ian. I think from my perspective, again, it goes back to that kind of the culture point and the understanding of whistleblowing as a beneficial activity. That's going to be quite a long and hard sell, but I think this is really it. You know, the law, we have a law in the UK, but it looks great, but, you know, it's often completely inaccessible and doesn't work, or people settle, etc. So if we can't force the law on organizations to treat people properly, we need to show why else they should be motivated to do something. And I think there's huge amounts of evidence coming out now showing how beneficial whistleblowers are to actually boosting organizations' reputations if they listen to them properly. And also to kind of stopping having that anti-fraud cut across there, where whistleblowers are shown to be, I mean, within the fraud report, it says very few cases were reported in any other way. I think overarchingly, whistleblowers should be recognised as a value to society, and if treated appropriately, a value to the organisations who they are employed by.
So how can we proactively protect whistleblowers?
So, well, we can't, but we can give information to organizations that will show them why they should do. So I think it goes back to Lorenzo's point, you know, it's changing the kind of culture and the conversation and saying that actually these people are valuable, and it shouldn't be an organization's first response to kind of go after the person. How do we do that? Through research, through evidence, through, you know, showing the organizations who do respond well to whistleblowers are commercially viable and have that competitive advantage because they're taking on board intelligence which can help them.
Ian, you wanted to say something, and then over to Mariana.
I would quickly add, I completely agree with what Laura just said, but there's also this sort of technological approach, and that is there's a lot of Mariana and Kate have done work on the anonymous whistleblowing hotlines, the increased use of this by companies. Now, if you can trust that they are anonymous, then use them and they exist. Otherwise, there's loads of anonymous whistleblowing platforms. WikiLeaks is still going, but there's lots of other platforms. Most countries have their own devoted platforms. There are also platforms devoted to specific issues such as green issues and trade mark issues and all sorts of. But there's lots of anonymity. I think is a very simple and effective form of protection if you can trust the anonymous hotline.
Well, there's a whole second symposium that we could hold on the relative merits of anonymity or confidentiality. So I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole either. I'm going to hand it straight across to Mariana.
I just only very quickly wanted to say that the implementation of the law is a continuation of a policy, right? There are no two separate things. There is no law and implementation unless this is actually embraced, you know, by organizations. How to go about that? Well, two things. I think on the one hand, there is an education issue, which should start early on. And I speak as an academic, actually here, and as a child of teachers, you know, so all I'm trying to say, we have to start early on teaching people actually values and courage. And that courage has to be recognized and rewarded, Ian, in tangible, material, and less material ways. We had this conversation, Ian, right? What is the symbolic recognition as well? But the other thing is also, I'm really sorry, but I think there has to be some coercive power as well. I mean, unless we interpret the law as Dominic Cummings and the Prime Minister chose to interpret, you know, it's just a travesty of a law, you know. And I'm sorry that I'm bringing such a high profile example, but nothing really diminishes the power of the well-drafted and well-meant legislation, actually that a dubious interpretation and an absence of application across the board. We are all equal in the face of law, right? That's the whole thing. Unless that actually happens, but that requires civic attitude, civic education, and also, you know, Well, may I just say, voting for leaders that really represent us, right?
Indeed. I mean, so to encapsulate the answer for Amrita, really, if you're going to set it up, give it teeth. Give it the ability to actually enforce what is meant to happen. Don't make it a toothless regulator, because it just will not work. And I just catch you on a point there that law is a continuation of policy. To us military men in the room here, it comes from Clausewitz, where war is a continuation of policy by another means. Anyway, I'll leave you with that remark, because we're down to the closing minutes of this symposium. So I'd like to round everything up really by saying thank you very much indeed to all of you who have taken part as panelists or star speakers, guest speakers. Thank you, Emanuela, for a fascinating exposition on why whistleblowing is a duty. Thank you very much indeed to Baroness Susan Kramer for taking the time out in the whole of today so far to give us the benefit of your experience, your long experience in Parliament, and for chairing the APPG on whistleblowing, which is a key element of what we're trying to do here. Thank you to my, if Mariana will now allow me to say, my fellow colleagues in academia.
Yay,
for
Victor.
your advice.
Victor.
Thank you, Kate and Mariana, for setting me on the path. Thank you also to all our attendees. We've had about 48 to 51 attendees from feedback from across the whole day. I'm still going to and thank you very much also to Michael Jarry, who has been in the background supporting us technically. He went for a cup of tea when I had my presentation. I got left on my own, but okay, for the rest of it, he's done very well indeed. And this will all be recorded. It will all be put up on a website that we've set up specially. We will send everybody who has registered a link to that website. You might have to give us a day or so to get it all up there, but it will be there for 6 months. And we will actually keep open the question and answers and try and provide answers to all the questions that were set to us. And hopefully set up a site or an area within it where we can put together some plans and strategies for how we can answer the key question, which is how to implement an Office of the Whistleblower. So with that, I'm going to say thank you very much indeed. It's been a pleasure to do, and it's been lovely to talk to you all. I think it's been very valuable. Oh, and finally, thank you to James and Zoe for giving me a hand here and keeping me on the road. Thank you very much.